Today we're going to be making a chicken meatloaf, and we're going to cook it in an electric pressure cooker. To make chicken meatloaf, the first thing you're going to need is some ground chicken. Now in my case, I didn't have any ground chicken. All I had were these boneless chicken breasts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grind some of this up and make my own ground chicken. Of course, if you can buy ground chicken from the store, you can just use that. You don't have to grind up your own chicken if you don't need to. This recipe works best if you have between 1.25 pounds to 1.33 pounds of ground chicken. So what I did here was I cut up about 1.25 pounds of those boneless chicken breasts into strips that are small enough that I could feed it into my meat grinder. But before I do that, I'd like to go over some of the other ingredients that you'll need for this recipe. You'll need 1 small onion, 1 large egg, some vegetable oil. I'm using canola oil here, but you can also use olive oil or any other vegetable oil. And you'll need some barbecue sauce. And here, going from left to right, you'll need 1/2 teaspoon of black pepper, 1/4 teaspoon or less of salt. I usually put in less than 1/4 teaspoon, but that'll be to your taste. 1/2 teaspoon of tarragon, 1/2 teaspoon of thyme, 2 tablespoons of dried parsley, 1/2 cup of breadcrumbs. I'm using roasted garlic, but you can also use plain. And the last ingredient is mushroom seasoning, and this is optional. The only reason I'm using mushroom seasoning is because usually in this recipe I'll put in some chopped fresh mushrooms, but this time around I didn't have any mushrooms. So if you want to put in chopped fresh mushrooms, you'll want to put in maybe about 4 medium-sized mushrooms, chop it up really fine, and then just add it to your meatloaf mix. What I'm doing here is I'm slicing my onion up into wedges so that I can feed it into my grinder as I'm grinding up the chicken. Now if you already have your chicken ground up, then what you want to do is finely chop your onion and then add the chopped onion to your ground chicken. Okay, so I have my meat grinder attachment hooked up to my stand mixer, so I'm ready to grind some meat. What I'll be doing is I'll be alternating between putting in a piece of chicken and a wedge of onion, and what that'll do is it'll mix the onion in as it's grinding the meat. Here's our ground chicken with the onion already mixed in, and now I'm going to start adding the other ingredients, starting with 2 tablespoons of dried parsley, Next, I add 1/2 cup of breadcrumbs, I add 1/2 teaspoon of thyme, half a teaspoon of tarragon, half a teaspoon of black pepper, and next I add a little bit of salt, usually less than a quarter of a teaspoon. Here I'm putting in 1 teaspoon of mushroom seasoning. As I mentioned earlier, this is optional. You can put in some chopped fresh mushrooms instead, or you can just leave it out completely. Next, I'm adding in 1 teaspoon of canola oil. You can also use olive oil or any other kind of vegetable oil that you may have. And the last ingredient that goes into the mix is 1 large egg, and I'm just making sure that I get all of it in. So now that we have all of our ingredients in the bowl, we just need to mix it up really well. I find that the best tool to use to mix it is just your bare hands, so make sure your hands are thoroughly clean and then just get in there and mix it up. So now that my meatloaf mixture is thoroughly mixed, I'm going to transfer it into this Pyrex glass bowl. It's a 4-cup capacity square bowl. Now normally when you cook a meatloaf, you would put it in a rectangular loaf pan, but since we're going to be cooking this in a pressure cooker, a rectangular loaf pan simply isn't going to fit. So this square bowl fits perfectly into my 6-quart pressure cooker. Now you don't have to use a glass dish, you can use ceramic, metal, or stoneware. As long as it fits in your pressure cooker and as long as it's oven safe, you should be okay. The last thing I'm going to do before I cook the meatloaf is I'm going to add some barbecue sauce to the top of it. The reason you want to add barbecue sauce to it is because when you cook things in a pressure cooker, it doesn't brown the meat as it would if you cooked in a traditional oven. So the barbecue sauce will give it some color and it'll also give it some flavor. As you can see, I'm running a little bit low on barbecue sauce. Unfortunately, I don't have another bottle, so I definitely have to add this to my shopping list, but in the meantime I gotta try to get as much out of this bottle as I can. And you really don't need a whole lot, you need just enough to cover the top of it. And here I'm just going to spread the barbecue sauce over the top of the meatloaf with the back of a spoon just to make sure that it's evenly coated. To prepare the pressure cooker, I'm going to put in the steamer rack, and I'm also going to add in 1 cup of water. Here's our meatloaf. I'm going to just drop it into the pressure cooker right on top of the steamer rack. put the lid on and make sure the pressure valve is sealed. I set the pressure cooker to cook for 20 minutes on high pressure. Once the pressure cooker comes up to pressure, it'll start counting down 20 minutes, and we'll come back to it after it's finished cooking. And our 20 minutes is up, so it's finished cooking. At this point, I usually let the pressure release naturally, so after that happens, we'll come back to it and then we'll take the meatloaf out and see what we've got. Alright, after letting the pressure release naturally, I took the inner pot out of the pressure cooker, and now I'm going to take the meatloaf out of the inner pot. Now, I usually like to let the meatloaf rest for about 10 minutes before I start cutting it up, so we're going to do that, and then we'll cut a few slices. It's been about 10 minutes and the meatloaf has cooled down a bit. I did drain some of the excess fat out of it, and now we're just going to cut a few slices. And there you have it, chicken meatloaf cooked in a pressure cooker. If you like this video, click the like button, subscribe, and thanks for watching.